The sun was burning hot over the Arizona desert, turning the dust into a golden mist as the prisoner's wagon rolled slowly down the trail. Inside sat a man who had once been the fastest gun in the West, Colt McGraw. His hands were tied with iron chains, his face darkened by sun and regret. People said he was the most dangerous outlaw west of the Mississippi. Some called him a killer, others called him cursed. But if anyone had looked into his eyes that day, they would not have seen anger. They would have seen a man who had already lost everything that made him human. Colt wasn't born with hate in his heart. He grew up on a small farm outside of Dodge City. His father worked the land and his mother sang hymns at night while the crickets sang along. When he was 16, a land baron's men burned his father's farm to take the property. Colt tried to fight them, but he was only a boy. By the time the sheriff came, everything was ash and smoke. From that day, he stopped believing the world had fairness. He left home and learned how to survive with a gun. Some said the devil rode beside him after that. Colt never corrected them, because maybe they were right. Over the years, he became known to lawmen and bounty hunters from Texas to New Mexico. He robbed trains not for greed, but because those trains carried the gold of the same men who had destroyed people like his family. He gave some of the money to poor ranchers, though no one believed it. To the newspapers, he was just another outlaw. They printed his name with big black letters, Colt McGraw, wanted dead or alive. His face was painted as a monster's. One cold morning, Colt's luck ran out. The Rangers caught up with him near the border after a long chase. His horse collapsed under him, exhausted, and Colt didn't have the heart to push it further. When they surrounded him, he didn't even draw his gun. He looked at the sky and said, "Guess the desert finally got me." They tied his hands, loaded him onto the wagon, and began the long journey to Yuma, where the gallows waited. The guards talked about him as if he wasn't there. "They say he shot 5 men in one day," one said. "Heard he once robbed a train with no bullets in his gun," said another. Colt said nothing. He just kept staring out at the endless sand, his mind somewhere between memory and emptiness. To him, the sound of the wagon wheels and the wind felt like a song of farewell. He wasn't afraid to die. What scared him more was how little anyone really knew who he was. As the wagon moved through the desert, the sun started to set behind the red rocks. The sky turned orange and purple, and long shadows stretched across the trail. One of the younger guards offered him a drink of water. Colt looked up in surprise. "You're the first man to offer me that in a long time," he said quietly. The young guard didn't answer, just handed him the canteen. Colt took a slow sip and whispered, "Thank you." It was the first kind word he had spoken in days. That night, they made camp near a dry riverbed. The guards tied him to a post and lit a small fire. The stars shone bright, scattered across the sky like silver dust. Colt sat quietly watching the flames dance. One of the older guards asked him, "You ever think about what you could have been if you'd taken another road?" Colt didn't answer right away. He stared at the fire and finally said, "Every day." The guard nodded, saying nothing more. When everyone else slept, Colt stayed awake, listening to the night sounds, coyotes in the distance, the wind moving over the sand, the rustle of something unseen. He thought of his mother's songs, the ones she used to hum when the world was still kind. He thought of the time before his name became a curse. A small tear slid down his cheek, hidden by the darkness. The next morning, the wagon moved again. The desert was harsh, but it had its beauty. Wide skies, tall mesas, and the quiet of forever. Colt found himself staring at a hawk circling above. It reminded him that freedom still existed somewhere, even if not for him. When they passed through a small town, people came out to see him. Children pointed, men whispered, and women crossed themselves. One man shouted, "Hang him twice for what he did!" The sheriff ordered everyone back inside. Colt just looked straight ahead. He didn't argue or defend himself. He knew people needed a villain to make themselves feel safe. Later that day, as the wagon crossed a canyon bridge, a sudden sandstorm rose out of nowhere. The wind howled, blinding the horses. The wagon shook, and the guard struggled to hold it steady. Colt closed his eyes as sand whipped his face. He heard shouting, the crack of ropes, and then the wagon tilted sharply. One of the wheels snapped, and everything went dark. When he woke up, the world was silent. The wagon was overturned, the horses gone, and the guards scattered. Some were hurt, others missing. Colt's wrists were still bound, but the chains had loosened when the wood splintered. He tried to move, pain shooting up his arm. A shadow fell over him. For a moment he thought it was another ranger, but when he opened his eyes, he saw a woman. Her hair dark as night, her skin sun-kissed, and her eyes sharp as a hawk's. She was wearing an Apache dress made from deerskin, and in her hands, she held a small clay jar of water. She knelt beside him and touched his shoulder gently. "You're hurt," she said softly. Her voice was calm, steady. Colt tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Why help me?" he whispered. The woman looked at him without fear. "Because you're alive," she said simply. She poured a little water on his lips, then gave him a drink. Her kindness confused him more than any bullet could have. She looked around, saw the wagon wreck, and said something in Apache that he didn't understand. Then she added in broken English, "No one here. You come with me or you die here." Colt blinked, unsure if he was dreaming. He didn't know this woman, didn't know why she cared, but something in her eyes told him she wasn't lying. With great effort, he nodded. She cut the rest of his bonds with a small knife and helped him stand. Together they walked into the desert, leaving behind the broken wagon, the fallen men, and the law that had already judged him. The sun rose higher, but her steps never slowed. Colt stumbled beside her, weak but strangely calm. He didn't know her name or her reason, but for the first time in years someone had chosen not to leave him behind. That night, as they reached a small camp near a canyon spring, Colt sat by her fire. She handed him a bowl of food and said, "My name is Naomi." He nodded, still too tired to speak much. After a long pause, he said quietly, "Colt." She smiled faintly and replied, "Then you live another day, Colt." He didn't know it then, but that single act of mercy would change everything, not just his fate, but the meaning of his life. The man who once rode with death was about to learn what it meant to live again, one quiet day at a time. The morning came soft and quiet, the desert glowing gold under the rising sun. Colt woke slowly, hearing the faint crackle of fire and the gentle sound of water running nearby. For a moment he forgot who he was. Then he remembered the wagon, the storm, the woman who had saved him. He looked around and saw her kneeling near a small stream, filling a clay pot with water. She moved with calm strength, her hair shining in the morning light. She was not afraid of him. That alone felt strange. He tried to sit up and pain shot through his ribs. Naomi turned when she heard him. "You need rest," she said in a soft but firm voice. Colt tried to smile. "I've rested enough for a lifetime," he said. But his voice was weak and she only shook her head. She brought him a small bowl of broth made from roots and herbs. The smell was simple but comforting. He hadn't tasted food like that in months. As he ate, she spoke little, only watching him with quiet eyes. After a while, Colt said, "You could have left me there." "Why didn't you?" Naomi looked at the horizon and said, "Because no one deserves to die alone." Those words stayed in his mind long after the fire went out that night. For the next few days, Naomi helped him heal. She treated his wounds with medicine made from plants. She knew the desert like an old friend, every rock, every cactus, every whisper of wind. Colt watched her work and felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. She didn't ask about his past, and he didn't tell her. She only called him by his name, not by the name the law had branded him. He tried to help her, but his body was still weak. One morning he followed her to gather wood. The sun was sharp and hot. Naomi walked ahead, graceful and silent. Colt stumbled a little and she turned, smiling faintly. "The desert tests everyone," she said. "Even strong men." He grinned, the first true smile he had managed in months. "Then the desert's got its work cut out for me," he said. When they returned, she showed him how to grind herbs for medicine and how to make arrows from desert reeds. Her hands were steady, her movements full of patience. She told him small things about her life. How her people once lived freely across the land, how she had lost her husband to illness, and how she stayed to protect the young ones who still came to her for guidance. Colt listened quietly, something heavy growing in his chest. She had suffered loss too, yet she hadn't turned bitter like him. At night they sat by the fire. Naomi sometimes sang in her language, low and soft, like the wind through the canyon. The sound made Colt close his eyes and remember his mother's voice. For the first time in many years, he felt human again. He didn't feel like an outlaw or a ghost chased by the past. He just felt like a man sitting beside a kind soul in a vast, quiet world. Days turned into weeks. His wounds healed and his strength returned. Naomi began teaching him more about her ways, how to find water under dry soil, how to read the sky before a storm, and how to move through the land without leaving a trace. Colt learned fast. He had always been good at surviving, but this was different. This wasn't about running or fighting. It was about living with the land, not against it. In return, Colt started teaching her people small things. He showed a few young hunters how to ride better, how to fix saddles, and how to use the stars for direction. Naomi watched him one day as he helped a young boy fix a broken bow. She saw something gentle in his eyes, something she hadn't expected from a man with such a past. That night she told him, "You teach with care. Maybe you were meant to guide, not destroy." He looked down at the fire and said, "Maybe it's too late for that." Naomi shook her head. "It is never too late to become someone else." Those words struck deep. He didn't answer, but in the quiet of the night he repeated them in his heart. One afternoon, Colt wandered beyond the camp. The desert stretched endless before him, red rocks glowing under the sun. He stood there for a long time, thinking about his old life, the robberies, the chases, the fear. He remembered the people who had trusted him and how he had lost them. He knelt down, touched the sand, and whispered, "I'm tired of being the man everyone fears." The wind blew softly, as if the desert was listening. When he returned, Naomi was waiting near the fire. She looked at his face and asked, "You found something out there?" He nodded slowly. "Maybe I found myself," he said. She smiled, not asking more. Sometimes silence said more than words ever could. As weeks passed, the bond between them grew. They spoke more, laughed sometimes, shared simple meals, and watched the stars at night. Colt began to feel something unfamiliar, hope. He wanted to protect the peace he had found, even if he didn't know how long it would last. One evening, a group of traders passed through the valley. They recognized him but said nothing, perhaps out of respect or disbelief. They told stories of how the law still hunted the outlaw named Colt McGraw, who was supposed to be dead. Hearing that name again felt strange, like hearing a ghost calling. When the traders left, Colt sat by the fire for a long time, staring into the flames. Naomi noticed his silence. "The past doesn't disappear," she said gently, "but it doesn't have to own you." He nodded, though the fear of being found again never left him. One night he woke from a dream. In it, he was standing on the gallows, the rope around his neck. But instead of a crowd, there was Naomi standing below, calm and silent. She looked at him and said, "You are not that man anymore." He woke with a start, breathing hard, and saw her sitting near the fire, keeping watch. For a moment, he wondered if the dream was a message. The next day, Naomi took him to a high ridge overlooking the valley. The wind was cool and the land spread wide below them. "This place is where I come to pray," she said. Colt stood beside her, looking out at the horizon. "For what do you pray?" he asked. Naomi smiled faintly. "For strength to forgive the past," she said, "and for the world to show mercy." He looked down, unable to speak. He realized she wasn't just talking about herself. She was talking about him, too. From that day on, Colt began helping more. He fixed broken tools, helped build fences, and taught the children how to make small wooden toys from cactus wood. The people began to trust him, though some were cautious. They saw how Naomi looked at him with calm faith, not fear. Slowly, he became part of their rhythm. Every night before sleeping, he would look at the stars and whisper a quiet promise to himself, to be worthy of the life Naomi had given him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he didn't dread it. Some evenings, Naomi would sit beside him and say nothing, just watching the fire. Once, she said softly, "When I found you, you were close to death. But maybe it wasn't your time to die. Maybe it was your time to start again." Colt looked at her and said, "If that's true, then you saved more than my life." She smiled gently. "No, Colt, you saved your own. I only showed you the way." And under that vast desert sky where the stars looked close enough to touch, Colt McGraw, the man who once lived by the gun, began to learn what it meant to live by grace instead. The days in the valley passed quietly, each one filled with new lessons for Colt. The sun rose and fell over the red cliffs, and life took on a rhythm that felt almost like peace. He woke early, fetched water from the stream, and helped Naomi with her work. Sometimes children from the nearby Apache camp would come running to see him. They had grown used to the tall, quiet man who fixed things and told gentle stories about horses and stars. Colt had never thought of himself as someone who could teach, but Naomi often smiled when she saw the children gather around him. "You have a kind heart," she said one afternoon. Colt looked down, his hands busy carving a small wooden horse. "I never thought anyone would say that about me," he said softly. Naomi shook her head. "You were lost once, but lost doesn't mean gone." In the evenings they shared simple meals of corn and beans. The nights were cool, and the sky stretched endless and bright. Colt often found himself talking more freely now, about the life he had lived, the choices he had made, and the dreams that had long since faded. Naomi listened without judging. "The past is a shadow," she told him one night. "It can follow you, but it can't hold you unless you let it." Her words stayed with him, echoing in his heart like a promise. One day, Naomi took him to meet the elders of her people. They lived in a small camp near the edge of the valley. The elders were wise, calm people, with deep lines on their faces that told stories of many seasons. They looked at Colt with curiosity but not fear. Naomi introduced him as a man who once walked in darkness but found his way through the light. Colt bowed his head, unsure what to say. An older man named Tanaya spoke slowly, his voice low and steady. "The desert gives all men the same choice," he said, "to fight it and die or to learn from it and live." Colt listened closely. The elder's words sounded like the truth he had been searching for all his life. Later, as they shared food around the fire, Tanaya said, "If your heart is clean, your past cannot chain you." Colt nodded silently. He was beginning to understand what that meant. The following weeks brought new challenges. The camp needed protection, not from danger but from hunger. The desert's dry winds made food scarce. Colt helped the men dig a trench to guide rainwater toward the crops. He worked hard under the hot sun, his shirt soaked in sweat, but he didn't complain. Every seed planted felt like a small act of hope. Naomi watched from a distance, proud of how he had changed. Sometimes, when the work was done, Colt would ride one of the horses to the far ridge and watch the horizon. He liked the quiet there, the feeling of the wind against his face. The vast emptiness reminded him how small his past seemed compared to the wide open land. He thought about all the years he had spent running, always looking over his shoulder. Now, for the first time, he didn't feel chased. He felt still. One afternoon, Naomi joined him on the ridge. She brought 2 cups of cool water and handed him one. "You look at the horizon as if it speaks to you," she said. Colt smiled faintly. "Maybe it does," he said. "It tells me that everything ahead of me is still unwritten." Naomi nodded. "Then write it with kindness." Her words were soft, but they felt powerful. As time passed, the people began to trust Colt more deeply. They invited him to gatherings, taught him their songs, and asked for his help with small things. He never saw himself as part of their tribe, but they treated him as one of their own. He was careful never to forget what Naomi had done for him. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, he said, "You saved me, Naomi. You didn't have to." She smiled and replied, "Maybe I didn't save you. Maybe I only reminded you who you were meant to be." That night, the stars seemed brighter than ever. Colt lay awake, staring at the sky. He thought about the people he had wronged, the lives he had hurt. Guilt still lived inside him, but it was no longer heavy. It was just a reminder, a weight that made him careful with every word and every choice. He promised himself that if he ever left this place, he would do good wherever he went. One day, a small boy from the camp got lost while chasing a goat into the canyons. The whole village searched for him. Naomi called out to Colt, her voice filled with worry. Without hesitation, he mounted a horse and rode into the desert. He searched for hours under the burning sun, following faint footprints and the sound of wind. When he finally found the boy sitting under a rock ledge, tired and scared, Colt lifted him gently onto the horse. "You're safe now," he said with a warm smile. The boy looked up at him and whispered, "Thank you." Those 2 words filled Colt's heart with a quiet joy he couldn't explain. When they returned to camp, the people cheered. Naomi's eyes filled with tears. That night, the elders lit a fire in Colt's honor. Tanaya said, "A man is not known by the sins of his past, but by the kindness of his hands." Colt bowed his head, humbled. Naomi whispered, "You have given them faith again." He looked at her and said, "You gave it to me first." The days that followed were peaceful. Colt began keeping a small journal that Naomi gave him, a rough leather book filled with blank pages. Each night he wrote down something good that had happened that day, no matter how small. The boy smiled today. The crops grew stronger. Naomi laughed at my bad cooking. Little by little, he was learning to see beauty in simple things. Sometimes, he caught himself looking at Naomi a little longer than before. She carried strength and peace in equal measure. He admired her not just for saving him, but for seeing what no one else had seen, the good buried beneath his mistakes. She too seemed to notice the change in him. They spoke less about the past now, more about the days ahead, about rebuilding, about teaching the children, about the seasons to come. One evening, a cool breeze swept through the valley. The sunset painted the sky in gold and pink. Colt sat near the fire carving another wooden horse. Naomi walked up beside him holding 2 cups of tea. "You work even when the day is done," she said. He smiled, handing her the small carving. "It's for you," he said. Naomi turned the figure in her hands, her eyes soft. "You've given something to this place, Colt. Something no one expected." He looked at her, his voice quiet but sure. "I think this place gave me more." They sat together as the stars came out, neither speaking for a long time. The desert around them was still, peaceful and alive with the faint hum of night creatures. Colt felt as though every mistake he had ever made was fading into the distance. He was still the same man. But he had found a new way to live. Not by running, not by hiding, but by giving back what little good he could offer. And as Naomi looked at him across the firelight, she saw no trace of the outlaw who once rode with death. She saw a man reborn in the heart of the desert, a man who had finally found a reason to stay. The morning air was cool when Colt rode out to check the water trench. The valley was waking slowly, soft light touching the hills and the roofs of small huts. Smoke rose from cooking fires and children's laughter drifted through the dry air. It felt peaceful, like a dream that had somehow become real. Colt never thought his life would feel calm again, yet here he was, alive and useful. Naomi had shown him how to belong somewhere again, even if the rest of the world believed he was gone. That day started like any other, but the peace did not last. When Colt returned from the ridge, he saw riders in the distance. They moved slowly but with purpose. Naomi stood outside her hut, watching the dust trail behind them. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Colt knew right away that something was wrong. "You know them?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No, but they look like men searching for something." Colt's heart sank. He had seen that kind of riding before. Rangers. He had hoped they would believe he had died in the desert, but maybe the world wasn't done with him yet. He took a slow breath, then turned to Naomi. "If they ask, you tell them nothing. I'll handle it." Naomi looked at him, her calm never breaking. "You have changed, Colt," she said softly. But the world does not always see change as truth. The riders reached the camp by midday. Dust clung to their coats and the sun glinted off their badges. Their captain was a tall man with sharp eyes and a deep scar down his cheek. Colt recognized him at once. Captain Harris, the same man who had once arrested him. Harris looked older now, wearier. He climbed down from his horse and scanned the camp before his eyes landed on Colt. "Well," the captain said, stepping closer, "I thought I'd buried you in the sand months ago." Colt didn't flinch. "You almost did," he said. "Guess the desert had other plans." The men around Harris shifted uneasily. The Apache people stood quietly, not reaching for weapons but not retreating either. Naomi stepped beside Colt, her face calm and proud. Harris looked from Colt to Naomi. "You've been hiding out here?" he asked. Colt shook his head. "Not hiding, living, working, trying to do something good for once." The captain studied him for a long moment. "You expect me to believe that?" Colt met his gaze. "I don't expect anything. But these people know me better than anyone else ever did." Naomi spoke then, her voice soft but firm. "He has brought peace here. He has helped my people. If you take him away, you take that peace." The camp was silent for a moment. Harris looked around, seeing the children, the fields, the repaired fences. He saw the respect in the eyes of the villagers. Not fear, not loyalty to an outlaw, but quiet gratitude. Finally, he said, "The law doesn't forgive so easy, Naomi. There's a rope waiting for him back east." Colt's voice was steady. "I won't run this time. But before you decide what to do with me, look at what's here. These people didn't ask for me, but they gave me a second chance. Maybe that's worth something. Harris sighed, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver. You know what they called you in every town we passed? The Devil of Dodge. You burned your name into half the territory. Colt nodded slowly. I know, and I'll carry that name as long as I live. But that man died out here, Captain. The desert buried him. Naomi looked at Harris. A desert can kill, she said, but it can also cleanse. Look at him. You see the same man? Harris said nothing. He walked past Colt and looked over the valley, the crops, the trenches, the children running by. Finally, he turned back. You taught them all this? Colt nodded. With her help. She saved me when your men left me for dead. The captain's expression softened for a moment, but his tone stayed rough. That may be true, but I can't just walk away. The law's the law. Colt looked him in the eyes. Then take me. But promise me one thing, don't harm them. They did nothing wrong. Naomi reached out and gently touched Colt's arm. You don't have to go, she whispered. You've earned your place here. He gave a faint smile. Maybe, but I can't let them pay for my past. Harris hesitated, then turned to his men. Lower your weapons, he ordered. No one here's our enemy. The Rangers obeyed, though confusion flickered in their eyes. Harris looked back at Colt. I'll take your story to the judge myself. Maybe he'll listen. Maybe he won't. But I've seen enough to know you're not the same man I caught. The captain stayed in the camp that night. The people welcomed the Rangers with food and water. Around the fire, Harris spoke with Naomi and Colt. He listened as Colt told him about the work they had done, about teaching, farming, and rebuilding. Harris asked, Why didn't you ever ask for mercy before? Colt looked into the flames and said quietly, Because I never thought I deserved it. Naomi watched the two men talk, her eyes full of quiet pride. The man who had once lived by the gun was now speaking with truth, not fear. Harris listened, his jaw tight, but his expression softened as the night went on. When he finally rose to leave, he said, I'll come back with an answer. No promises, McGraw, but I'll tell them what I saw. Colt nodded. That's all I ask? The next morning, the Rangers rode away, their horses kicking up dust as they disappeared beyond the ridge. The camp stood silent for a long time. Naomi turned to Colt. You would have gone with them? She asked. Colt looked down. If it meant keeping you safe, yes. Naomi shook her head slowly. You think your worth is a debt you have to pay. But your worth is already here in what you've done. Her words filled him with both peace and sorrow. He had spent so many years believing he had to earn forgiveness, and now someone was telling him he already had it. Days passed, and the valley went back to its calm rhythm. Colt worked harder than ever, though his mind often wandered to what might come. He didn't know if Harris would keep his word, or if men with badges would one day return. But something inside him had changed. He wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever happened, he would face it with the same calm Naomi had taught him. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Naomi found him sitting by the stream. You're quiet again, she said gently. Colt looked at the reflection of the sky and the water. I keep thinking about how life gives second chances when we least expect them, he said. I never thought I'd live long enough to see something good come from my name. Naomi sat beside him. The desert takes much, but it also gives. It gave you a new name, one spoken with respect. Colt smiled faintly. And what name is that? She looked at him, eyes warm. Teacher. He laughed softly, shaking his head. Never thought I'd be called that. Naomi smiled. Life surprises those who listen. That night they sat near the fire, watching the stars scatter across the sky. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and rain. Naomi began to hum a song, low and peaceful. Colt closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a man waiting for punishment. He felt like someone who had found home. The days that followed were quiet again. The crops grew tall. The water trenches filled after a rare rain, and laughter echoed across the valley. Sometimes Colt would still ride to the ridge to watch the horizon, but not to run. He went there to give thanks, and for life, for redemption, and for the woman who believed in him when no one else did. He had once been known as the most dangerous man in the West. Now, he was just a man who had learned that kindness could be stronger than any weapon. The world beyond the desert might never know his story, but in that valley it was written in every smile, every crop, and every sunrise. The morning sun rose slowly over the valley, painting the sand in soft gold and red. A gentle wind carried the smell of sage across the open land. Colt sat by the stream, sharpening an old tool with quiet focus. He no longer woke up feeling like a man running from his past. Each day now began with peace, the sound of water, the laughter of children, the hum of life returning to a place that once knew only silence. Naomi came walking from the garden, carrying a basket of corn. She smiled when she saw him. "You've been up early again," she said. Colt nodded. "Habit, I guess. A man who's wasted years learns not to waste daylight." She laughed softly, setting the basket down beside him. "Then maybe you're making up for all that time." He looked at her, eyes calm but filled with meaning. "Maybe I am." Weeks had passed since Captain Harris and his men left. No message had come since, and part of Colt still wondered if the law would return one day. But instead of living in fear, he chose to live in the present. He worked the land, helped the families, and taught the young hunters how to track without harming the earth. The people trusted him now, not as an outsider, but as one of their own. One afternoon, while teaching the children how to ride, Colt saw a small group of travelers approaching from the far side of the canyon. Dust rose around them like a pale cloud. Naomi came out of her hut, shading her eyes. "More strangers?" she asked quietly. Colt nodded. "Maybe traders." When the travelers arrived, one of them stepped forward, an older man with a worn hat and kind eyes. "We're from Tucson," he said. "Heard there was a man here teaching folks how to live off the land. Said his name was McGraw." Colt smiled slightly. "Guess word travels fast," the man chuckled. "Not fast enough. Folks back in town still think you're dead." Colt's smile faded. Naomi looked at him, curious. "And what do they say now?" she asked the man. He shrugged. "Some say the outlaw got what he deserved. Others say he found redemption among the Apaches. Hard to know which story's true." Colt looked at the horizon for a moment before replying. "Maybe both are true." The man nodded thoughtfully. "You've done something rare, McGraw. Folks like us, we don't get to rewrite our names often." The travelers stayed the night, trading small goods for food and water. Around the fire, they told stories from the towns, about railroads growing, new families moving west, and peace slowly taking hold. Colt listened quietly, realizing how far the world had moved without him, but instead of regret, he felt peace. The world didn't owe him anything. He had found his piece of it right here. The next morning, before leaving, the old traveler said to Naomi, "You've done a fine thing for this man." "You gave him back to himself." Naomi smiled gently. "He gave himself back to the world," she said. Colt watched them ride away, feeling gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. As the days grew warmer, the crops flourished. The valley bloomed with life, tall corn, healthy horses, and laughter echoing through the canyons. Naomi often said the land had healed because its people had healed too. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she and Colt sat near the fire. The sky turned violet and gold, and a quiet peace wrapped around them. Naomi spoke first. "Do you ever wish you could go back?" she asked. Colt stared into the flames. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember what I was running from. The man I was back then wouldn't have lasted in this place. He wouldn't have deserved it." Naomi's eyes softened. "And the man you are now?" He looked at her and said softly, "He's still learning to be worthy." That night, rain came to the desert for the first time in months. The sound of it falling on the rooftops and soil felt like music. The people came out laughing, lifting their faces to the sky. Naomi stood in the rain, smiling like a child. Colt watched her, feeling something deep stir inside him. Not the restless fire that once drove him, but something gentler, gratitude, hope. Later, they stood together under the awning, watching the rain wash away the dust. "This land has waited for this," Naomi said. Colt nodded. "So have we. Seasons changed. The valley became green again, dotted with wildflowers. More travelers came, seeking to learn from the community Naomi and Colt had built. They called it a place of peace where anyone could start over if they worked with honesty and heart. Colt helped them all, never turning anyone away. He told them what Naomi once told him, that the desert tests every soul but spares the ones who listen. One evening, a young man arrived from the east. He carried a letter sealed with wax and dust. "Are you Colt McGraw?" he asked. Colt hesitated, then nodded. The man handed him the letter. "From Captain Harris," he said. Colt sat by the fire, opened the letter, and read slowly. Harris had written that he had spoken to the judge, told him everything about what Colt had done. The rebuilding, the peace, the teaching. "Your sentence," the letter said, "is lifted. You are free to live your life where you choose. The law has no claim on you anymore." Colt read the words twice, his hands shaking slightly. Naomi sat beside him, waiting. "It's over," he whispered. She looked at him with quiet pride. "No, Colt," she said softly. "It's beginning." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. The next morning he rode to the ridge where he had once stood feeling lost and alone. Now he looked over the valley, green and alive beneath the bright sky. He thought about the man who had come here in chains and broken, bitter, and ready to die. That man was gone. The one standing here had been reborn by kindness, by trust, and by the quiet strength of a woman who saw good in him when no one else did. He rode back to the camp slowly, breathing in the warm air. Naomi was waiting by the fire. When he dismounted, she asked, "So what will you do now?" Colt smiled softly. "Keep living. Keep teaching. This is home now," she nodded. "Then that's enough." That night the villagers gathered for a feast. Music filled the air and laughter echoed through the valley. The children danced and the elders sang old songs under the stars. Colt sat among them, not as an outsider or a legend, but simply as one of them. When Naomi placed her hand on his arm and said, "You've given this place a story worth remembering," he smiled and replied, "It's our story now." As the fire burned low, Colt looked up at the sky. The stars above were the same ones that had watched over his hardest nights and loneliest roads. Now they felt closer, brighter, almost friendly. He thought about how far he had come, from a hunted man to a humble teacher. Years later, when Naomi's hair had turned silver and Colt's hands had grown rough with age, the valley still thrived. Travelers still came, speaking of the outlaw who found peace among the Apache. But to the people of the valley, he was never an outlaw. He was the man who taught them to listen to the land, to forgive, and to believe that even the hardest hearts can change. When Naomi passed one quiet spring morning, Colt carved her name into a smooth stone near the stream. Beneath it, he carved a single line: "She taught the desert to forgive." He sat beside that stone often, speaking to her as if she were still there, telling her about the children, the rain, and the sunsets. And when his own days grew few, he asked to be buried beside her, not as the outlaw Colt McGraw, but simply as Colt, a man who had finally found home. And so, the story of the Wild West's most dangerous outlaw ended not with gunfire or fear, but with peace, the kind that grows quietly, like a seed watered by mercy, deep in the heart of the desert.